そう、舞台監督。
Yeah, your first job is to watch this little one. And for God's sake, do not let her get wet.
Cold opener for this one featured Doremi trying to pull off a basic magic trick.
Now you see, this is what happens when you get your kids one of those dollar store magic trick sets for Christmas. You have to tie it in somehow.
The episode proper opened with
Get out of here! Go away!
Thank God I'm blind.
So, after bashing out our heads a few dozen times just to forget what we saw, we learned that the witch frogs were practicing for a talent show in the witch's world. Della also came in to reveal that the Botas were also going to let it double as an apprentice exam open to all ranks, which meant Doremi could participate alongside her friends who were one ahead of her, which, yeah, that is a tad bit too convenient, especially since they all got promoted in just the last episode, but whatever, I'm sure there won't be any other contrivances in this whole episode. Of course, they had to decide on what sort of act they would do for the show. Personally, I would suggest ventriloquism, considering that their lip flaps clearly weren't matching up with what they were saying, and yeah, this is a Mitsuru Aoyama episode, so you know the drill by this point. Anyway, the Ojamajo also tried asking their families for advice.
Dude, you know you were a Sentai and not a putty, right?
But yeah, I do kind of like this setup, as each of the Ojamajo were taught tricks by their elders that they would be able to apply later for the talent show. It's foreshadowing that some might not even be aware of the fact that it's foreshadowing at first, as all of the scenes are played up more for laughs. Kind of clever. As a result though, the Ojamajo believed that they still didn't have anything for the talent show, so they got a little inspiration from Joe Kido? No, actually, this kid was their resident Houdini, Watabe, who was mastering the art of sleight of hand and reusing animation, again, thank you Aoyama. Anyway, the Ojamajo figured that they could imitate some of his tricks for the show, but he naturally refused to teach them because unless they put on a luchador mask, magicians don't reveal their secrets that easily. Fortunately, they ended up going to Watabe's residence, which turned out to be a stationery store. There they met his father, who turned out to be his son's influence, though he wasn't going to try and pull off any escape acts anytime soon.
Dad, could you please go have your midlife crisis someplace else?
As a result, the young Watabe was going to replace his father for an upcoming magic show, which, you know, considering that they already made posters for it, I think you should also be offering some refunds if the main performer everyone was expecting to see wasn't gonna show up. Just saying, y'all are kind of opening yourselves up to a false advertising lawsuit. Moreover, since it would be kind of creepy for an older lady to be an assistant to an elementary school kid, Watabe was in need of an assistant his age, which, hey, you can always count our heroines to be a bunch of moochers. Thus, they held some tryouts to see who he could best work with, and not too surprisingly, our heroines weren't exactly up to par.
Though, gotta give credit to Doremi for mastering the art of pouring underneath the pitcher.
Ultimately, Watabe chose Hazuki to be his assistant, while Aiko would be the MC. As for Doremi, he basically just gave her producer credit, and thankfully, unlike a Michael Bay-produced film, made sure her fingerprints were nowhere near his show. However, she would have to get involved after he started botching up his tricks. So to help him, she went through her whole transformation sequence and of course her usual spell sequence, and yeah, I'm pretty sure half the audience has already left by this point.
Not unless you pull a Gabon or something.
Also, it was at this part of the episode that I thought that some of this might play into the talent show later, with Doremi burning through all of her spears, leaving her with almost nothing by the end, much like what happened with many previous exams, and they would have to work around that disadvantage, but
nope.
Instead, her using up her spheres really didn't play into anything, as Watabe just kept on botching things up.
You know, but An easier solution would have been to just bring out Aqua.
Also, does Trissy Wright know you stole her magic panties? Watabe then took a little break before the climax, as he was able to recognize that he was messing up his tricks, and yet didn't question how they all suddenly broke the laws of physics. He admitted that he was suffering from stage fright, which I don't think was ever built up in this episode, but still, Doremi did her big heroine moment and repeated Mr. Watabe's words.
Yeah, just kind of disregard the fact that you've been helping him along the whole way.
Yeah, I'll get more into this during the closing thoughts, but for now, I think it kind of goes without saying that this was one of the weaker morals of the day for a series that managed to deal out its lessons a lot more effectively than this. Anyway, the show went on and,
Okay, Lampy, don't be too off or else up. We're gonna need a new magician.
Nah, of course, the show was successful and gave the Ojamajo the confidence they needed to tackle their own talent show. Thus, they made their way to the witch's world, where rightfully Mashrikazak was heckled off, though so were a lot of other much more impressive acts. Or at least impressive from the Ojamajo, and by extension, the viewer's perspective. But for this audience?
Now, this is actually a really interesting conflict that I wish had been the main focus of this episode. How would the Ojamajo go about impressing essentially a bunch of superhuman beings from an environment very different from ours?
As far as this show has established up until this point, the witch's world seems to be very similar to the human world, likely because of their interactions before the fallout of the bad items incident, as well as the few witches covertly living amongst the Mughals. Through their magic, they not only managed to replicate many things from the human world, but also made many of our more difficult tasks all but mundane.
It's basically the classic, what do you get the man who has everything conundrum, or in this case, what do you do to impress the crowd of sauced witches? Well, use practicality.
Yeah, I won't lie, while I do have some issues with this episode that we'll get to in just a minute, I do really like this resolution with the Ojamajo using sphereless magic, aka magic tricks, not too dissimilar from what Watabe was doing. It's a good way of connecting the stories together, while also highlighting the big difference between the human and witch's world. Magic has become so widely utilized that the concept of practicality has become the outlier rather than the norm. Thus, the Ojamajo managed to impress them with some rather basic tricks that they had learned from their families, again good foreshadowing.
That said, I do have to at least instinctively kind of roll my eyes at Doremi's trick.
No! That's impossible!
With that, the Multas not only gave them passing grades, but they also won the whole show, meaning that the Queen could grant them one wish.
Not today.
No, instead, they just requested that Doremi be allowed to skip a rank, meaning that that whole episode of her failing her exam because of her lack of self-control and inability to keep her eye on the prize, and being rightfully punished for it was,
barely an inconvenience.
And I get it, it's a selfless act from her friends and all that, but really, Doremi doesn't get any sort of, character arc to overcome her flaws. She just repeats someone else's quote multiple times in one episode, and that's enough. Okay, sure.
While there certainly were some clever ideas here, I don't think they were executed all that well. I think the biggest thing that held this episode back was unfortunately the classmate of the week, Watabe. While not necessarily unlikable, he was incredibly bland to the point I wasn't all that invested in the A plot of this episode, and thus when the B plot involving the town show connected back to it, it kind of brought the whole episode down. I don't know, it just kind of felt like a lot of things were just happening for the sake of the plot, likely because it is almost the end of this first season.
Putting aside his annoying repeated animation, Watabe was just not given a whole lot of characterization, especially compared to the Ojamajo's previous classmates. This was likely because he and his father were meant to be more like plot devices than anything else. Just the means of helping inspire the Ojamajo through a bit of a bog standard platitude, and hell, they already learned their wing tricks from their families, so really, if anything, they felt a little frivolous. The magic show itself was worth a few laughs, especially when Doremi was overly helpful, but honestly, I just wish more focus was given to the B-plot of this episode with the talent show. That was where all of the real developments were taking place, and involved the much more interesting plotline of the Ojamajo trying to figure out ways to impress an audience from another world. I think if they had given this just a little more time, it would have made Doremi skipping 2 ranks feel a lot more earned after she had failed miserably last time. So, overall, while this had some good ideas, it was ultimately overshadowed by a bit of a cheap magic show. Maybe next time they should bring in the ultimate magician, that would make things infinitely better.
So yeah, even though this wasn't technically a Christmas episode, I did decide to break out the hat and the green background because 23rd is close enough, right? Yes, there was another Christmas episode I could have covered for another series I covered the same time slot, but honestly, I decided to hold off on that for reasons I'll explain when we get to it. Still, until then though, farewell for now my friends, and hey, how about a magic trick? Just think about any poker card and I'll try to draw it out. You got it? Okay, is this your card? Well, it's a wild card, so technically it counts as anything, right?